3. The Watchman's Adventure. "Why, I declare there's a pair of galoshes," said the watchman. "They must belong to the lieutenant who lives up there on the top floor, for they are lying in front of the door." A light still burned upstairs, and the honest fellow was perfectly willing to ring the bell and return the overshoes. But he didn't want to disturb the other tenants in the house, so he didn't do it. "It must be quite comfortable to wear a pair of such things," he said. "How soft the leather feels." They fitted his feet perfectly. What a strange world we live in. The lieutenant might be resting easy in his soft bed, yet there he goes, pacing to and fro past his window. There's a happy man for you. He has no wife and he has no child, and every night he goes to a party. Oh, if I were only in his place, what a happy man I would be. Just as he expressed his wish, the galoshes transformed him into the lieutenant body and soul, and there he stood in the room upstairs. Between his fingers he held a sheet of pink paper on which the lieutenant had just written a poem. Who is there that has not at some time in his life felt poetic? If he writes down his thoughts while his mood is on him, poetry is apt to come of it. On the paper was written, "If only I were rich." If only I were rich, I often said in prayer, when I was but a tiny lad without much care. If only I were rich, a soldier I would be, with uniform and sword most handsomely. At last an officer I was, my wish I got, but to be rich was not my lot. But you, O Lord, would always help. I sat one eve so happy, young and proud, a darling child of 7 kissed my mouth, for I was rich with fairy tales, you see. With money I was poor, as poor can be. But she was fond of tales, I told, that made me rich, but alas, not with gold. But you, O Lord, you know. If only I were rich is still my heavenly prayer. My little girl of 7 is now a lady fair. She is so sweet, so clever, and so good. My heart's fair tale she never understood. If only as of yore she still for me would care. But I am poor and silent. I confess I do not dare. It is your will, O Lord. If only I were rich, in peace and comfort rest, I would my sorrow to this paper never trust. You whom I love, if you still understand, then read this poem from my youth's far land. Though best it be you never know my pain, I am still poor, my future dark and vain. But may, O Lord, you bless her. Yes, a man in love writes many a poem that a man in his right mind does not print. A lieutenant, his love, and his lack of money, there's an eternal triangle for you. A broken life that can never be squared. The lieutenant knew this all too well. He leaned his head against the window and sighed and said, "The poor watchman down there in the street is a far happier man than I. He does not know what I call want. He has a home, he has a wife and children who weep with him in his sorrows and share in his joy. Ah, I would be happier if I could trade places with him, for he is much more fortunate than I am." Instantly the watchman was himself again. The galoshes had transformed him into the lieutenant, as we have seen. He was far less contented up there and preferred to be just what he had been. So the watchman turned back into a watchman. "I had a bad dream," he said. "Strangely enough, I fancied I was the lieutenant, and I didn't like it a bit. I missed my wife and our youngsters, who almost smother me with their kisses." He sat down and fell to nodding again, unable to get the dream out of his head. The galoshes were still on his feet when he watched a star fall in the sky. "There goes one," he muttered. "But there are so many, it will never be missed. I'd like to have a look at those trinkets at close range. I'd especially like to see the moon, which is not the sort of thing to get lost in one's hands. A student for whom my wife washes says that when we die, we fly about from star to star. There's not a word of truth in it, but it would be nice just the same, if I could take a little jaunt through the skies. My body could stay here on the steps for all that I'd care. Now, there are certain things in the world that we ought to think about before we put them into words. And if we are wearing the Galoshes of Fortune, it behooves us to think twice. Just listen to what happened to that Watchman. All of us know how fast steam can take us, whether you've either rushed along in a train or sped by steamship across the ocean. But all this is like the gait of a sloth or the pace of a snail in comparison with the speed of light, which travels 19 million times faster than the fastest racehorse. Yet electricity moves even faster. Death is an electric shock to the heart, and the soul set free travels on electric wings. The sunlight takes 8 minutes and some odd seconds to travel nearly 100 million miles. On the wings of electricity, the soul can make the same journey in a few moments, and to a soul set free, the heavenly bodies are as close together as the house of friends who live in the same town with us, or even in the same neighborhood. However, this electric shock strips us of our bodies forever, unless, like the Watchman, we happen to be wearing the Galoshes of Fortune. In a few seconds, the Watchman took in his stride the 260,000 miles to the moon. As we know, this satellite is made of much lighter material than the Earth, and is as soft as freshly fallen snow. The Watchman landed in one of the numerous mountain rings that we all know from Dr. Maedler's large map of the moon. Within the ring was a great bowl, fully 4 miles deep. At the bottom of this bowl lay a town. We may get some idea of what it looked like by pouring the white of an egg into a glass of water. The town was made of stuff as soft as the egg albumen, and its form was similar, with translucent towers, cupolas, and terraces all floating in thin air. Over the Watchman's head hung our earth like a huge dull red ball. Around him he noticed crowds of beings who doubtless corresponded to men and women of the earth, but their appearance was quite different from ours. They also had their own way of speaking, but no one could expect that the soul of a Watchman would understand them. Nevertheless, he did understand the language of the people in the moon very well. They were disputing about our earth and doubting whether it could be inhabited. The air on the earth, they contended, must be too thick for any intelligent moon man to live there. Only the moon was inhabited, they agreed, for it was the original sphere on which the people of the old world lived. Now let us go back down to East Street to see how the Watchman's body was making out. Lifeless, it lay there on the steps. His morning star, that spiked club that Watchman carried, had fallen from his hands, and his eyes were turned toward the moon that his honest soul was exploring. "What's the hour, Watchman?" asked a passerby. But never an answer did he get. He gave the Watchman a very slight tweak of the nose, and over he toppled. There lay the body at full length, stretched on the pavement. The man was dead. It gave the one who had tweaked him in a terrible fright. The Watchman was dead, and dead he remained. His death was reported and investigated. As day broke, his body was taken to the hospital. It would be a pretty pass if the soul should come back and, in all probability, look for its body in East Street and fail to find it. Perhaps it would rush to the police station first, next to the directory office, where it could advertise for lost articles, and last of all to the hospital. But we needn't worry. The soul by itself is clever enough. It's the body that makes it stupid. As we said before, the Watchman's body was taken to the hospital. They put it in a room to be washed, and naturally the galoshes were pulled off first of all. That brought the soul dashing back to post haste, and in a flash the Watchman came back to the life. He swore it had been the most terrible night that he had ever experienced, and he would never go through it again. No, not for 2 pennies. But it was over and done with. He was allowed to leave that same day, but the galoshes were left at the hospital.